Well, recently, over the past 7 years or so, I've been looking at the rise of right-wing nationalism and white nationalist movements, particularly encompassed by the euphemism, the alt-right, around the world. And I'm more recently also looking at the GAFAM and the way that it's been responding to the alt-right in conjunction with anti-fascist activists and activist practices. So my paper kind of bundles all this together, but then tries to speak to the theme of today's conference as well. So it's called The GAFAM's Privatized Hate Speech Governance, the Case of the Alt-Right in Canada. So I'm going to talk a bit about the alt-right. I'll then talk a bit about the GAFAM, then I'll sort of put it in the Canadian communication and cultural policy framework to wrap up. So what is the alt-right? Well, from the 2016 election campaign of Donald Trump to the present day, the alt-right has become a populist force in global politics. The alt-right is largely a euphemism for an authoritarian populist white nationalist or white supremacist movement that rejects the Republican and Democratic Party's neoconservative and neoliberal consensus and hates the left especially, as all fascists historically have. More and more today, the alt-right or the white nationalists will sort of bemoan the power of cultural Marxists and especially sort of the new resurgent democratic socialist movements in the United States and around the world. So what does sort of the alt-right think? What's their epistemology? What's their philosophy? What's their political ideology? Well, folks on the alt-right call themselves race realists, and they take race to be the most essential and most important component of a group's identity. They take a page from the biological racial nationalist discourses of the 19th century bourgeois Euro-colonial empires, and they sort of revivify this, seeing the planet as naturally divided between different races of people. Guided by the notion that each race of people should have its own sovereign state, again, kind of like bourgeois nationalism in the 19th century, the alt-right's endgame today in the 21st century is the formation of white territorial race states, separate from groups of people racialized as non-white. So committed to the craft of race making, of making an essential ontological white race, alt-right propaganda pits a supposedly virtuous race of white people against an evil global and national power elite that threatens so-called white racial identity with genocide or extinction when it advances policies of immigration, hybridity, and multiculturalism. And so this is a typical populist rhetoric, you know, a good people versus a bad elite. And the sort of role of the vanguard alt-right proponents and propagandists is to organize those good people to overthrow the elite and then make sort of a new society in their racist image. So very much a right-wing populism as distinct from forms of left-wing populism today. So the alt-right declares the need to reproduce white identity, again, this construction of white identity in a world of many competing and clashing racial identities, sometimes even going so far to say they're doing identity politics for white people, which is a complete obscuration, of course, of the real history of identity politics in the United States and elsewhere, that they're apples and oranges in the way they're being used here, but nonetheless, they use that term. The alt-right folks see themselves as the vanguard of a struggle to protect and promote the fiction of a white race against the supposed threat to that racialized identity by people who have been racialized as non-white. So the alt-right is behind all kinds of hate crimes and hate propaganda targeting Jews, Muslims, and other racialized people. And you've seen sort of, again, in tandem with the Trump presidency, you know, this astronomical rise of hate crimes in the United States and elsewhere. The alt-right, nonetheless, does not have one big political party, even though we assume an affinity directly between Trump and the alt-right. But it instead sort of fights for its cause with a network of different groups, not all that sort of align or sort of think or act in the same way. There's debates in the alt-right and the far right, just as there is in the far left, about strategy and tactics. But nonetheless, the alt-right uses violence and persuasion, a combination of force and consent, to achieve tactical goals, as related to a larger strategy of taking state power through Republican Party entrism, or alternately through fomenting a violent insurrection or revolutionary race war. So those are basically the ways that they're sort of thinking through politics today. Well, the alt-right has some presence in the streets. It is most active online. And so a lot of the work I've done is focused on how the alt-right uses minor social media platforms of its own making, such as 8chan poll boards, Parler, BitChute, Gab, Telegram, Odyssey, and Fascist Forge, as well as major corporate media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit, and Discord for political communications. So, if you break down the uses of that the alt-right makes of these platforms, minor and major, you basically see them using platforms to create their own pages, profiles, and channels, make themselves audible and visible in the digital mainstream, connect with, recruit, mobilize, and radicalize followers, spread propagandistic memes, articles, and videos far and wide, fundraise to fund their movement. And there's a lot of white nationalist millionaires that actually use these platforms to fund the alt-right, to produce and consume or prosume harmful and hateful speech, and of course, to engage with, trolls, target, swarm, intimidate, harass, bully, and attack racialized minorities, as well as the white liberals and leftists who they see as cucks and race traitors. I receive a lot of spam and hate mail in my academia edu profile because I write a lot of articles criticizing the alt-right, and then they use that platform to send me mail saying I'm a cuck and race traitor and so on. And then I respond to them and try to challenge their worldview. So, the white supremacy, of course, has a long history tied with the rise of Eurocolonial empires, with the rise of the United States. But the alt-right was recently incubated in the United States under the Trump presidency, and it has been going global, thanks in part to Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, or what political economists refer to as the GAFAM. So when GAFAM embedded its operations in other societies, when GAFAM embedded itself within the political economic structures and institutions of other societies, they networked together billions of people around the world and opened these people's homes, screens, phones, hearts, and minds to many things, including the American alt-right. As these Silicon Valley titans expanded across borders, the American right flowed with them, forming transnational linkages with allies in a new white nationalist internationalism. And again, we see the rise of the far right and these new forms of essentialist ethno-nationalism all around the world. And Zainab also spoke to that in the previous paper. So through the GAFAM platforms operating in Canada, American alt-right groups have virtually entered Canada, so to speak. In early 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center identified 51 active far-right hate groups. And on January 15, 2018, I did a quick Facebook search for all of these, and I found that 28 had active Facebook presence, active Facebook profiles, meaning that 54% of these US hate groups were present on Facebook and virtually present in Canada. More recently, I did a quick Twitter search from some significant alt-right influencers, and I identified many of them. So for example, Richard Spencer, who's a white nationalist who calls for peaceful ethnic cleansing, I don't think it can be peaceful, and also coined the very term the alt-right, has over 70,000 followers on Twitter right now. And I recently completed a study of 100 tweets with the Islamophobic alt-right hashtag #RemoveKebab. And these construct Muslims as threats to the West and America, and they try to rationalize genocide against Muslim people. So the alt-right is very much active on these platforms. That said, it would be simplistic to argue, apropos media imperialism theory that I've attempted to revivify in some ways and augment for 21st century research, that this is just a one-way flow of American alt-right hate into Canada and elsewhere with no two-way or reciprocal flow between these far-right groups. To the contrary, Canada has many homegrown alt-right extremists, and a recent study found over 6,000 right-wing extremist social media channels, pages, and accounts linked to Canadians. Even still, so much alt-right propaganda does originate in the United States, and it spreads around the world by platforms. But there's a silver lining, I think, in some ways. As much as the GAFAM are frequently associated with the alt-right's rise and internationalization, their platforms are also being used by a wide variety of activists on the left to try to bring the alt-right down. So a few examples. A New York creative worker made a Google Chrome extension called Stop Normalizing the Alt-Right, which automatically replaces all search references to the alt-right with neo-Nazi. On YouTube, leftist creators and democratic socialist creators challenge alt-right propaganda. Innuendo Studios' The Alt-Right Playbook, How to Radicalize a Normie, is a brilliant deconstruction of alt-right recruitment and mobilization rhetorics. Vosh and numerous democratic socialist live streamers are frequently engaging in debates with alt-right pundits and demolishing their bad arguments, even humiliating them in front of like 70,000 viewers in real time. So there's interesting things going on in these platforms that are also countering the far right and the alt-right propaganda. On Facebook, activists are organizing protests against the alt-right. For example, in August 2018, an Islamophobic rally was set to occur in Nathan Phillips Square in Toronto, headed by the Worldwide Coalition Against Islam, which is an alt-right affiliated group. But this white nationalist rally was stopped by a number of local activists that organized a We Stop the Hate rally on Facebook. And they actually showed up, and I showed up as well, and the actual sort of Islamophobic rally didn't happen. Across Instagram, memes spread far and wide to mock, satirize, and degrade the far right. One anti-fascist slogan is "Good night, all right." And a popular rendition of this meme features Gritty, basically the Philadelphia Flyers mascot that was appropriated by anarchists and turned into their mascot. And you have sort of this meme of Gritty pummeling Peppy the Frog, which is a symbol of the alt-right as well. So, what sort of, lots of really, really cool activism happening. I've conceptualized this elsewhere as a new digital united front to sort of combat and counter platformization of fascism. But what we're also seeing is the GAFAM, these big corporations getting involved in deleting and deplatforming the alt-right as well. So over the past 3 years, and as I show in a recently published essay in this book, Media and Law, that was just published last month, Between Free Speech and Censorship, the corporations that own the major platforms have been taking down alt-right pages, channels, persons, and posts with a new privatized hate speech policy and censorship regime. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on that now. So how did that come to be? Well, in the United States, federal and judicial Maine, the citizen's First Amendment right to be free from state censorship of speech, defined as hateful, trumps the citizen's right to be free of speech that might afflict them with hateful invective. In the United States, the work of governing the platformization of hate speech online is not undertaken by the state, but rather by the corporations that own the platforms. Apropos Section 3 of the Short-Lived Communications Decency Act, the GAFAM are not today legally obliged to uphold the First Amendment rights of their users, but the law does empower them to support or suppress their platform's users' interaction and speech without the liabilities of a publisher or a broadcaster. And Nick mentioned this earlier. As Tarleton Gillespie puts it, Section 230 lets GAFAM, quote, claim the right, but not the responsibility to remove users and delete user-generated content, and largely protects these corporations from as much legal liability as possible while ensuring they have the most discretionary power. So what this means is that, the GAFAM can choose or not choose to take a hands-on or hands-off approach to their users and the speech of their users flowing across their platforms. Nowadays, they very much take a hands-on approach. So by requiring users to click I agree or I accept to terms of service and then defining appropriate and inappropriate communicative behavior and expression for users via community guidelines, GAFAM decide what is and is not permitted on their platforms. They preside over social media content moderation apparatuses that combine a normative communication, interaction, and content framework with an enforcement and punishment mechanism. So very much, the GAFAM govern speech in very specific ways, and ways that are really not determined by governments or even necessarily by forms of public consultation, but rather simply by writing their own speech and interaction policies and then enforcing them with a mechanism that is also quite punitive. So recently, GAFAM added hate speech policies to their content moderation apparatuses. Some are defined openly as hate speech, and others are embedded tacitly in the terms of service and community guidelines clauses pertaining to objectionable or offensive user content. So these corporations have created these content policies, sometimes on their own terms, sometimes with a black box of experts. In any case, GAFAM's hate speech policies are expected to be enforced by users themselves, who are invited to self-police the platforms and search for and report potentially hateful content to an algorithm. Basically human sort of content moderators that are then paid by these corporations, usually in very miserable working conditions that are non-unionized and contractual, will then basically review the content that users have flagged and decide whether or not it should be taken down based upon the corporation's own speech and behavior policy. If the content moderator finds the reported content to be in violation of the hate speech policy, they may delete it from the platform. If they determine a user's conduct transgresses the policy, they may issue a warning, suspend their account, or simply banish them. So this sort of work of human-centered content censorship mixes with automated content review and censorship practices. And over the past few years, we've read a lot of news stories about the GAFAM deplatforming and deleting much alt-right content. That said, the GAFAMs reliant upon their users to enforce hate speech policies may not be the one best way to purge hate from the platforms, because most people use these sites for entertainment and socialization, not because they wish to police the speech and behavior of white supremacists and white nationalists. For those of us that do have the time, energy and interest to govern these platforms for the GAFAM without pay, GAFAM's privatized systems sometimes fail. I'll give you an example. I participate in a Facebook group that monitors far-right organizing in Toronto, and we also monitor far-right groups who use Facebook to propagandize by reporting them to this content moderation system. So a few weeks ago, we found that Ronnie Cameron, a Toronto-based white nationalist, has a significant presence on Facebook and a following of about 14,000 people. I'm now doing a study of Cameron's Facebook use, and over the past year, Cameron's posted hateful content that conveys the idea that white people are going extinct and need a white-only state, the idea that Jews and Muslims threaten white people, and the idea that BIPOC are inferior to white people. So I've got a year's worth of content that hasn't been taken down. And last month, Cameron posted a video program containing all kinds of racist disinformation, starring an overt neo-Nazi. So I reported Cameron's page to Facebook as hate content, but no luck. Facebook determined that Cameron's page was not sufficiently hateful, according to its own self-defined policy, to be removed, noting it just might be offensive to me, but it doesn't violate its policy. So this is interesting with regard to Canadian communication and cultural policy, and I'll just wrap up now. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects freedom of expression within reasonable limits, but I take the alt-right's hate speech to be an unreasonable affront to Canada's multicultural democracy and a threat to the freedom of Canadians, especially those who have been targeted and are being targeted by the alt-right's hate online and off. The Canadian Criminal Code prohibits hate propaganda, and the CRTC's unamended Broadcasting Act of '91 would not tolerate the transmission or the flow of programs full of hate speech by radio and TV broadcasters. But when it comes to GAFAM's platforms, the alt-right's hate too often freely flows. When the federal government has some policy tools for dealing with hate speech, it for too long followed the United States' cyber libertarian approach and stood aside while GAFAM wrote and acted as judge, jury, and executioner of their own terms of service and community guidelines pertaining to hate speech. As a consequence, I'd argue, and apropos, I think, my larger interest in sort of the concept of media imperialism at all levels, not just content, the GAFAM have universalized a particular American-made mode of dealing with platformized hate speech. The work of governing the conduct of the alt-right hate groups and hate speech on platforms through which millions of Canadians interact each day has largely been exempted from public deliberation and decision-making and efficiently uploaded to the oligopolistic transnational corporations that have decided for themselves and for the rest of us what the terms and conditions of free speech and hate speech are, what guidelines we all must follow for them and their bottom line. And of course, they're doing this not because they're committed to social justice or anti-racism per se, but because they want to appease shareholders and advertisers, augment their brand identities, and drive maximal network effects to grow their user base and keep their Wall Street stocks bullish. So going forward, I'd say keep sort of participating in anti-alt-right activism online. There's wonderful activism that's happening online and off, but that activism can only achieve so much. I think much more should be done to govern the platformization of hate speech with help from public interest law, policy, and regulation. So that's the gist of my presentation. Thank you.